Okay, thank you for joining us, everybody, and welcome to our latest tech talk, why an open source hosting platform makes sense for the Open Website Alliance. So my name is Bryan Gruneberg. I'm a consulting solutions architect for Amazy.io. I am all about the open web and open source more generally. I'm involved in a lot of digital project delivery. That's everything from infrastructure and hosting activities through to the actual application software. Everything I do is based on open source and deeply rooted in open source. So just quickly, some terminologies and some intros. So who is Amazy.io? Amazy.io is part of Mirantis. It's a wholly owned company of Mirantis. It is a global team of open source and Kubernetes experts providing open source platform as a service for engineering teams to deploy applications more easily. It is built by developers for developers, and it is also the company that I'm working for. What is Lagoon? Lagoon is the open source application delivery platform for Kubernetes. It is the software that runs inside the Amazy.io platform, and it was open sourced by Amazy.io back in August 2017, and Amazy.io is the main contributor to the project, and by proxy, so is Mirantis. My goal today is essentially three things. I want to attempt to persuade you that if you are convinced by the Open Website Alliance's mission and values, then you are actually already convinced of the value of an open source hosting platform. I'm going to try to convince you that the adoption of a truly open source hosting platform becomes a kind of logical conclusion of the Open Web Alliance, and that there are very few fully open source hosting platforms out there, and that Lagoon, our open source platform, deserves a slice of your attention. So let's first define a little bit what the Open Website Alliance is. The Alliance has been founded to facilitate collaboration between open source content management system projects. And this happened kind of off the back of an initiative in Europe. Although it is a global initiative, it happened in Europe because of some of the European Union systems and processes and legislation that is being kicked around. So essentially, they have two goals. They are there to educate about the open source benefits and principles, or this is one of the Alliance's mission, and to be a source of advocacy for open source benefits and principles. So the Alliance really seeks to promote and defend the rights of these projects and to create a better internet, a better web. It also aims to encourage website owners and developers to choose open source over proprietary systems and to be a source of education for those decision makers. This is everybody from the person who's building their personal blog all the way through to enterprise website decisions. So through this advocacy, this alliance aims to expand opportunities for all open source CMS projects and actually all open source projects that are involved in the open web. So really, the Open Website Alliance is a community of communities. It's a community that aims to be a platform where the members of these communities can share and discuss best practices to benefit the public perception of open source projects. Also to benefit the reliability of these projects, and obviously to contribute towards the quality and safety of choosing open source, as well as those open source communities. Wherever possible, the Alliance is aiming to support third-party open source projects and communities on which their projects depend. So if you're interested in, I'm not going to go much more deep into the actual Alliance, but there is a QR code that will take you to a PDF of the actual map, the actual founding document. There you can learn more about the membership, the leadership, the voting, and perhaps the most important, which is the Open Web Manifesto. It's the first appendix inside the founding document. The Open Web Alliance in this Appendix 1, really they seek to define and talk about what the open web is. And if you read through it, you'll really see the goal is to see the open web. It's more than a technology. It's actually a social cause is probably a good way to think about it. What do we mean by the open web? So the open web is really built on freedom. With open web technologies, you don't need permission to learn or build or advance your skills or career or your website, advance in the broad sense. Literally, the goal is that anyone, anywhere can contribute to making the open web better. The open web is defined by decentralization. No single person or entity controls the open web and should ever control the open web. You can perhaps contrast this to the the social platforms, how they are not defined by decentralization. The open web thrives on inclusion. Everybody in the world can have a home on the open web, whether that be as a consumer, maybe you're reading a blog or a company's website, a user, a creator, an architect, an innovator, and they can really be involved in this regardless of their background, their identity, their ability, their wealth, their status. It's meant, the open web is by design and by principle inclusive. Importantly, the open web requires participation. The only way that this can work is if it is treated as a shared resource, a shared good, and also a shared responsibility, and it is sustained by deliberate choice and collaborative effort. This goes back to what I was talking about earlier when we say, the goal of the Open Website Alliance is to promote the choice of open source software for the open web. The open web really exists for empowerment. It's fueled by humanity's collective quest for information, connection, and progress. Anybody who was around in the late 80s, early 90s, in the when the internet started becoming a thing, will that'll resonate with you. But importantly, in 2024, the open web is strengthened by individual rights to choice, to privacy, and to security. The Open Web Manifesto, essentially, to live up to these ideas that we've just spoken about, it's almost impossible for the open web to be built on proprietary technologies. There's three things that the Open Web Manifesto claims. The first is an open web must be designed to protect, not exploit, personal data and public discourse. It must enable the next generation of innovators and entrepreneurs to compete. And it must be resilient to the changing world that we all find ourselves in and not controlled by a select few. So with all of that in mind, keeping the Open Website Alliance's mission and what is defined as the open web, let's have a quick look at how the industry standard application hosting platforms stack up and how does our product Lagoon address these points. The first thing we said is a technology must be designed to protect, not exploit, personal data and public discourse. The platforms that exist out there generally do take data protection seriously. Almost everybody runs on almost everybody has a data protection policy and does a good job of trying to make sure that public data is used or personal data is used in a respectful way and is not exploitative. When it comes to public discourse, platforms generally run on a platform from on a spectrum from freedom of speech all the way through to total protection of the people hearing the speech. So the question comes: what if you want to be in total control of your data, of your hosting platform, and what protecting public discourse means to you? You kind of have to, at the moment, or in many cases, pick the provider that seems to be the most aligned with your policies and preferences and sort of hope that that works out. So with Lagoon, because it is a fully open source piece of software, you can actually run your own platform or hire a company to run the platform for you. There's no vendor lock-in in terms of being forced to use Amaze.io. You can run a total Lagoon-based Kubernetes deployment engine on your own with a company that is aligned with your values. So the next point we said is that it must enable the next generation of innovators and entrepreneurs to compete. Now, competition is almost always, specifically online, about scalability and flexibility. So scalability can be difficult. Oftentimes with the existing platform providers, scalability is difficult because it requires having capacity available all the time to account for spikes that happen some of the time. When it comes to flexibility, if you use a platform, for example, built for Drupal, it can be either difficult or impossible to run, for example, a Node.js application alongside Drupal. It gets increasingly difficult to host different technologies all on the same platform as a service. Think maybe you have a Drupal enterprise site, but you also have a Python machine learning calculator in the back end, and you have some Java components or .NET for those who are into that sort of thing. So when it comes to flexibility, a lot of the time innovators end up with 3 or more hosting providers. We see this all the time. You've got different platforms for different things. Lagoon is based on or deploys into Kubernetes, and it leverages containers. So this platform provides pod scaling as well as compute node scaling. And essentially, we like to say if you can run it in a Docker container, Lagoon can deploy it into Kubernetes for you. So the third point we made was, a platform for the open web must be resilient to a changing world and not controlled by a select few. Again, using Drupal as an enterprise open source CMS, there are approximately right now 4 major hosting platforms that you could choose, Lagoon and Nemezi.io being one of them. 4 is not a particularly big number, considering how many of the world's enterprise sites run on Drupal. If you expand beyond Drupal and you look at include WordPress into that, the stat was quite shocking. Almost 1% of all websites in the world, so just bear in mind how many that is, 1% of all websites are hosted on a single provider. That is really quite intense. So from Lagoon's perspective, as a fully open source platform, organizations are both empowered and encouraged to actually run their own platform as a service. This is the first part of my claim, right? If you buy into these open source values, then embracing a fully open source hosting platform is kind of a logical conclusion. And the way we can state that is, if your CMS is open source and your tooling is open source and your contributions in many cases are open source, shouldn't your hosting platform be too? So one of the questions that come up when you're choosing a platform as a service is always about trust, right? You want to go, particularly large enterprises want to host their website and their web applications on a platform that is trusted. So let's look at the application side, right? How does Drupal or WordPress or Typo3 or Joomla, how do they earn the trust that we place in them? I would argue that there are essentially 3 places or 3 sources of trust for our open source CMS software. Social proof is I said 3, I meant 4. Social proof is, of course, important. Corporate and institutional adoption is very much an important thing. That's why Drupal is used so frequently. A partner ecosystem is important. You want to know that there are partners out there that can help you with your open source software. Customization and flexibility is important. A big part of choosing a web platform is the customization and flexibility that you have in order to stand out in an increasingly competitive market. And in many cases, Drupal, WordPress, Typo3, or Joomla are chosen because of their open source development model. So if the application side is about these 4 things, how do the hosting platforms generally stack up if we were to compare them with those same 4 things? Let's start with the social proof. I think the popular hosting platforms that are out there generally do a really good job of driving broad adoption of the whole idea of a platform as a service model. Again, looking back 20 years ago, almost everybody that ran a website somehow ran their own server, whether that was in their server room or, hosted in a co-location. And the platforms as a service model that came in, kind of somewhere between 8 and 12 years ago really has, been the beneficiary of a really large adoption. So I think there's plenty social proof ranging across, ranging from small businesses all the way through to government enterprises, large enterprises in the public sector. So I think choosing a platform as a service is a good model. The partner ecosystem, the existing platforms as a service, they too have I think have done a good job of building their partner ecosystems. Most platforms that you look at will have partner pages and, independent agencies and solution providers that you can go to who will help you, with your hosting requirements. And I think their partner ecosystem goes a long way to actually driving the social proof and helping decision makers buy and adopt platform as a service solutions. When it comes to customization and flexibility, there is a spectrum of customization and flexibility when it comes to hosting providers. And that's kind of the same as how it is in the application space, right? I mean, just looking at the Open Website Alliance, you've got Drupal and Joomla and WordPress, Typo 3. There's quite a lot of choice in just those four, and of course the choice is broader. So when it comes to the hosting platforms, some are custom built for their respective technologies and can be difficult to customize, and others are super flexible. The interesting thing for me is that almost none of these platforms embrace the emerging open standard for containerizing web apps. Some of them do, and many of them do utilize containerization under the hood, but how they're doing it and how to leverage it is basically a black box that we can't see into in many cases. Some people would argue that that's fine because you're buying a platform as a service. I would argue that that kind of goes against the whole idea of how open source software works and is meant to work, and starts to break the whole adoption of open source. Like I said earlier, if your CMS is open source and your contributions are open source and even your tooling is open source, why don't we take it, to its logical conclusion? And so this brings us to the fourth point, which is an open source development model. If you look in the application space, there is a massive both commitment and adoption of a fully open source development model for most website and web application frameworks and languages. When it comes to the open source hosting, when it comes to the hosting platforms themselves, I will say that almost all providers promote and support the open source software that they host, and that is it's a really, really important thing. However, almost none of them actually have open sourced their underlying platform. Like, what are they doing? How is it working? How can it be contributed? How can it be innovated on? None of that is possible in the actual platform side in 90% of the cases. One of the arguments will be that platforms would say is we do this from a security and a perspective. And I don't buy that for the same reason that I wouldn't buy that if a proprietary CMS said, oh, we don't open source our code from a security perspective. I will just simply point to Linux and the open source operating systems out there that run 99% of the internet and say, well, is that insecure too? So I find this perplexing at best and to be contradictory behavior at worst. With all of that in mind, why do I think that Lagoon is a compelling open source hosting platform option for anybody who's running any of the software that is part of the Open Website Alliance? And I'd actually extend this claim to be and beyond, basically any open source software. Firstly, I think that Lagoon and the Amaze.io platform really ticks all the boxes. It's designed to protect personal data and public discourse. And it does that through being fully open source. If you adopt this platform, if you adopt Lagoon, you can set your own rules. You can choose the engineers or the companies or the platform that runs Lagoon, that runs Kubernetes, that runs the containers, and you can decide what data protection means and what public discourse means for you. When we say it needs to enable the next generation of innovators, I think Lagoon, and we've seen that in some of the startups that have adopted Lagoon, it needs to be flexible, and Lagoon is super flexible, really because of the adoption of Docker containers and Kubernetes. Kubernetes-powered auto-scaling and auto-healing brings a super professional and scalable platform to everything from innovators all the way through to entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs at enterprises. We say that it must be resilient to the changing world. Lagoon follows Docker, it follows Kubernetes, and it follows the application delivery standards and best practice that are out there in an open way, in a contributed way. Open source is resistant to vendor lock-in. That is that is kind of the whole goal, right? So by adopting a fully open source top to bottom platform, you control the platform and you set your rules, whether that be your enterprise rules of how you want your data protected, through to your own rules as an entrepreneur or an individual who's hosting their own blog and website. To look at some of the other things where I think it ticks the boxes of things we've spoken about, when we look at corporate and institutional adoption, One of the largest implementations of Lagoon and one of our best reference cases is GovCMS for Australia, where hundreds of government websites are hosted on Australia. We have tons of large enterprises, from large, venture-backed, in fact, listed startups. I guess we could call them SaaS platforms, through to pharmaceutical and engineering companies that have adopted Lagoon to deploy their web apps and websites. Startups have adopted Lagoon, everything from small startups to funded startups. We've got a huge community of agencies that have adopted Lagoon and Amazy.io. And perhaps the most important thing is the Lagoon team, who happen to work at Amazy.io but are run as an independent team, actively seeks adopters beyond just Amazy.io and our business. We have agencies and teams in other countries that are running Amazy.io on their own. They're running Lagoon on their own without the corporate support of Amazy.io. When it comes to the partner ecosystem, we've got developers building Lagoon in an open source community way on GitHub and Discord. That all of that happens, all the development of the platform happens in the open, in public, in an inclusive way. We've got implementers implementing Lagoon who are, again, not at all associated to Mirantis or Amazy.io, which is super exciting for us, and we actively encourage that. We've got developers deploying on Lagoon. Thousands every day are deploying their applications to Kubernetes clusters around the world. And we've got agency partner and professional support and services via Amazy.io. So if people have adopted Lagoon in an open source way, but need professional support, that exists via a commercial offering. So I think Lagoon is also a compelling option from a customization and flexibility. Like I said earlier, if you can containerize it, Lagoon can deploy it into Kubernetes for you. For example, I'm working on a startup with a colleague that deploys Lightning nodes as part of the Bitcoin ecosystem for the Bitcoin network using standard Lagoon for deployment. There's, so the same Lagoon that is deploying websites and web apps in the hundreds and thousands for enterprises and governments. I'm using the same tooling and the exact same software to deploy a completely different category of financial applications. And then, obviously the one that means the most to me is our open source development model for Lagoon. It is 100% open source top to bottom. We have a community of developers using and implementers, and there are very few other platforms as a service that can not only make that claim, but can stand by that claim. Okay, so the question I have is, how did I do? So in the beginning, I said that I wanted to persuade you about a bunch of things. So my question would be, did I persuade you that if you are convinced by the Open Website Alliance's mission and values, then you are already convinced of the open source hosting, of the value of an open source hosting platform? Did I convince you that the adoption of a truly open source hosting platform almost becomes a logical conclusion of the Open Web Alliance? And I hope that I was able to convince you that there are very few what we describe as fully open source hosting platforms, and that Lagoon deserves a slice of your attention. If I have convinced you of this, I would like to invite you to explore Lagoon with us. Firstly, you can come say hi on the Lagoon Discord. If you go to lagoon.sh, you'll find the link to the Discord channel up there. As I mentioned, all development happens in the open. You can find the entire code for the entire platform at github.com/use Lagoon. As I mentioned, visit us at lagoon.sh to find more about the deployment engine. And also from a commercial perspective, if you're interested in using the software or having the software implemented for you, come and check us out at amazy.io. I'd also say that if you just want to play with Lagoon and you don't want to set up the entire platform for yourself, you can get a free sandbox at any time with Amazy.io by emailing us at outreach@amazy.io. So with that, I will say for anybody watching, seamless. We've got a couple upcoming webinars that are actually super, super interesting. The first one is seamless orchestration, basically managing virtual machines and containers together with the software called KubeVirt. Our featured presenter there is Kevin Lin from Mirantis. He's a senior solutions architect. Really super interesting topic. And if you're at all using virtual machines and containers, definitely worth checking out. The second topic is coming up on July 26th. So, just more than a month out, or 2 months out, actually. This is planning your VMware migration to OpenStack. With all the changes in the VMware ownership recently, it's a very interesting topic to real-world use cases of migrating from a fully VMware stack to OpenStack in an open source way with Mirantis. Our featured presenter there is Bruce Matthews, also a senior solutions architect from Mirantis. So yeah, do check those out. Watch out for the socials. You'll see some advertisements coming up. And with that, I will say thank you for your attention today. I appreciate you all attending. If you've got any questions, queries that weren't covered, or you'd like to find out more about our open source platform, please check us out at mirantis.com or amazy.io.